Just got a question about like illness and accidents and things like that. So all accidents are to get attention?
Well, they usually indicate that you're feeling quite lonely. You feel that people are not providing you with enough feelings that they want to know you or want to understand you, or you feel like they are not giving you enough validation and approval for the things you do. Generally it's linked to all of those things, and then generally when we create an accident, we've got a lot of those emotions, but the underlying demand is that people give us more attention. And then of course people do, because naturally people want to care for you when you're in distress. And so it's a very easy way to get, when I say easy, it's painful, but it's a very easy way to get the attention without actually saying, oh, I really want this attention. You know, it's a very passive thing to do.
Or changing yourself.
And also you're willing to even cause yourself pain in order to get that attention. So you see it happening a lot with children who have accidents in particular, where they don't understand, but they're ready to cause themselves pain just to get that feeling that they're being noticed and they have some attention.
I've noticed in myself that when I get sick, it's serving a purpose for me. Like there's always, I don't always nail it or feel it, but I've become aware that I'm creating this because it's serving a purpose.
Sickness is obviously a different, aren't they? Because what type of sickness does have an impact as well. So a lot of sicknesses relating to head colds and other things like that, which you're prone towards, and chest things, are a lot related to feeling like you don't want to grieve, and having a sickness causes people to sort of back off and leave you alone for a while. So it's about also getting feeling not as pressured and not, so up until then you're not grieving pressure or grieving being pushed around or grieving being controlled by others or feeling like you have to do things for others when you don't really want to. And then instead of dealing with that feeling, you generally will create a sickness, and then in creating the sickness, everybody's, gives you space and time then. But in the end, it's because you just didn't want to feel the grief associated with what was happening before then.
Makes sense, but it's a silly thing to do.
And most of us don't realise when the way in which we get sick has a bearing on what things we're trying to avoid. So, like for myself, when I was younger, I was very prone to getting sick, like once a month, and it was basically because everyone around me just didn't take any notice of what I did or anything like that. I was just expected to keep doing, and the only time I had really any time for myself was when I got sick.
Okay, thanks.
But some of you get sick because you don't want to deal with the lack of love in your environment, and it's a way of being able to withdraw from what's going on around you rather than deal with it head on with the people around you, because that will trigger the grief, and you don't have the grief, so you withdraw into this.
If you have to confront people's unloving behaviour towards yourself, for the most part, you would be if you dealt with it properly, you would be triggered into feeling, crying, into feeling grief. But the average person doesn't want to cry, and so they either want the other person, somebody else, to change their behaviour towards them without having to say anything and without having to do anything, or they create an illness in order to change the behaviour of people around them. Which is a very common thing to do.
Or as you say, just to get a respite from.
Just to get a respite.
It's like some people have the emotional belief that now this is a legitimate reason for me to withdraw from my environment.
Well, everybody has that belief, even the people who are well. Oh, you're sick, so I want to stay away from you now. It's not. Oh, you're sick, let's spend more time together. For the most part, it's like, you're sick and I don't want to get your bug, so I'm staying away. So it's sort of like an automatic way of preventing people from putting extra pressure on Does that make sense? Without even having to say anything about it. So the advantage of that is that if you look at it as an advantage, it's not an advantage, but the advantage of it from your perspective is that, now people stay away from me and I get a bit of time for myself. In the case of, okay, well, I'm sick now, I've hurt myself, people come and care for me then. So, sort of the opposite thing. Not if you have accidents, sicknesses usually are a bit about either manipulating people's behaviour into caring for you, or about them staying away. Accidents are a lot about people caring for you only. Like trying to get attention, trying to get people to care for you, trying to get. Obviously you don't feel anybody does, but you don't want to feel that. Because it's a hard feeling to feel. It's a lot of sadness to recognise that hardly anybody on earth cares for you in a real way, Yeah.
And that's I noticed that for you, Seth, and you, Kat. That's you both living with a lot of loneliness and unfelt grief about things, and because you don't feel it, you end up creating the accident, which meets the addiction to continue to avoid the feeling.
Yeah. It happens for Alan as well.
Yes, it does.
Has fairly regular accidents as well. People are more prone to it as they age as well, because obviously there's more sadness that's collected up over time, and oftentimes they've lost a partner or lost their relationship, their primary relationship, and so they're living alone, and so there's a lot of factors in why it increases as a person gets older. So a lot of times, it's like, I'm infirm, that's why it happened, but it's not really why it happens. Because even when you're infirm, if you loved yourself, you would take care of you'd know your limitations and you would take care of yourself well, and you wouldn't put yourself in positions where you would have an accident. Law of attraction around accidents is interesting too, because usually the people around the person generally don't have much to do with the person, and then when there's the accident, then they have more to do with the person. So that's also indicative of the fact that the people around the person are not really loving to the person in a day-to-day basis. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks.
Of course, you can give a lot more complicated answer, because where you get the breakage and what happens there, there's, when it comes to illnesses and accidents, where the accident occurred and what effect it has on you has a bearing on the emotions that you're trying to suppress as well. So, it gets a lot more complicated than what I'm saying, in the sense that, why a person breaks an arm rather than a leg. There are very, after you understand the body and understand the emotions and where they're stored, you understand why it was a leg and not an arm. But the key thing to focus on first is the emotion you're trying to avoid. In terms of, once you start digging or delving into it more deeply, God can share with you actually the precise emotion and why the particular problem happened exactly where it happened. Yeah. And of course, if it happens, if two people break their leg in exactly the same way, then they've got exactly the same emotion. Sometimes you see that actually, where in a family, within a very short period of time, two people will break something in exactly the same way. Nikki, you were going to ask?
Are infections similar to illness type thing?
Yeah, but obviously infections begin with a problem
Yes.
that is uncared for.
Yes.
So you can see that also has other emotions, doesn't it, involved in it.
Yeah.
So let's say you got a cut in your hand, let's say, and you didn't care for it properly, then eventually it might fester and bacteria might get into it, and then you'll have an infection, and now you'll need, from a medical perspective, they say take some antibiotics. But why did that infection occur? It happened because you weren't prepared to care for yourself.
Right.
With the first problem. So frequently what happens is a person will have a small thing happen to them with an infection. Obviously when it comes to operations, well that's a big thing, not a small thing, but oftentimes infections start with very small things that we're unwilling to care for.
Right. Right. So infections tend to kind of be stuff where we're not wanting to be loving with ourselves for a certain reason.
For a reason, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Whether it's you're trying to tough it out and be stoic.
Yes.
That happens a lot, where people are just... I remember once my brother just had a small cut on his hand. It probably needed 3 stitches, but he didn't bother going to the doctor at all. 3 days later, he had a strep infection right up to his shoulder, and if he'd left it 2 more days, he would have been dead.
Wow.
Fortunately, by that stage, the pain was so great that he went and cared for it. And see, this is a part of what happens with infections, is the pain keeps increasing until you care for it. So that's indicative of your original problem, which is you didn't care enough for it when the pain was small.
Right.
Does that make sense? And of course, the original accident happened for an emotional reason that you didn't care for either.
Yeah. That's interesting. So I've had a tooth infection. I got it like a month ago.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like I'm like, okay, I'm going to try and feel it. I'm going to try to figure out what it's about.
Yeah.
And I ended up feeling. I felt some stuff, and it kind of went away and it's come back. And then I was just like, no, I need to check it out. So I read online and it said tooth infections, you can't get rid of them. You've got to get it sorted.
Well, you can get rid of them if you deal with the actual causal motion.
Right.
But for the most part, teeth, emotions relating to your teeth have a lot of worth issues involved in them, and the majority of people won't deal with them.
Yes.
Because to deal with them, you've got to deal with some pretty substantial emotions.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's on my right side, so it's that's kind of stuff I'm avoiding, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, that makes sense about infections and the cause for them and stuff. So thanks.
Yeah. So if you know you're not dealing with it emotionally, the wise thing to do is go and deal with it medically, obviously. But it'd be better if you dealt with it emotionally, because then the original problem wouldn't exhibit itself in the first place. Of course, infections can also occur because you have done some damage of some kind through an accident that you haven't cared for or decided to do anything about.
Yep.
So sometimes an infection, so the original accident occurs because of a lack of care of self sometimes. And then, of course, because of the lack of care of self, there's a higher likelihood of infection. And then you get the infection and then try to not care for it either. That's what the average person does, particularly a man. Most men don't like going to the doctor or anything, right? Yep. So they won't care for it. And then of course it just gets worse. The problem just gets worse and worse and worse and worse until you're forced to go because you're in so much pain that you have to do something now. Yeah. And that's indicative of the fact that you were tolerant of small amounts of pain.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean by that?
Yeah, so you're tolerant to the smaller amount because you don't want to feel the emotional reason. Yeah. So if you're more sensitive, you'll just cry about the tiny bit of pain.
Yeah, well if you were really sensitive, you would already have dealt with the emotion that would have caused the accident in the first place, so you wouldn't even have the accident.
Yeah.
But for most people, they're not that sensitive, and so the accident comes, and then if you're sensitive enough, you can feel the results of that accident. Most people don't do that either. And so then, of course, the subsequent things have to also occur before you become, starting to deal with the problem. But for the majority of people, they don't deal with that either, and instead they just go and get medicine up to deal with the problem. So the problem with that, of course, is that your likelihood of a recurrence is high. And this is why oftentimes they say, there's a genetic disposition towards that particular problem. Because, people usually in the family, there are co-relations between the type of emotion and the type of accidents, or type of emotion and type of injuries, type of emotion, type of sicknesses, type of emotion, type of infections. And so people say, oh, well, that particular family, that's why they ask you when you have your history.
Yeah.
Because they want to know those relationships for physically, but they don't see them emotionally.
Yeah. And you know, in the first century, when you were around in the first century then, you know, when like you got like really injured and stuff.
Yep.
And you said you didn't get an infection.
Yep.
And is that because of you didn't have the worth emotion, like
correct.
the grief with worth and things like that?
With the extent of my injuries, the average person would have died.
Yeah.
Usually within a week or so. Well, one of the times, you know, I had exposed flesh for months in one time, where, you know, they'd speared me through my hip into the ground with a hot spear, and then speared me through the other shoulder to keep me on the ground as well, through my left shoulder, and straight through. And they cut up my face and then got dogs to sort of, you know, eat that part of my face and everything. And so in the end, if you look at it, and then I was dragged behind a horse for quite some time, naked. So when you add all those things up, the average person, and I had a broken back, they broke my back as well. So the average person would, you know, with all of those things happening, would probably die, and that was their intention, that I'd die a slow death. Yeah. Now, if you had a tendency towards infection, of course, you would have gotten an infection. In the first century, if you got an infection, you were dead. You know, there was no way of stopping it once it started, generally.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well,
chronic pain is avoiding generally something from childhood?
Yeah, if you think about how pain develops, you get these initial niggles, don't you? Generally, that's how things happen. You get these initial niggles, and eventually the problem just gets larger and larger and larger and larger until it becomes problematic. And then for most people, it just keeps getting larger and larger and larger until they actually, you know, for most people nowadays, they'd go to a doctor, and if it was an organ, they'd have it removed, if it could be removed. If it's like things like a cancer or something, they try to get it removed. If it's something that's essential to your body, like your brain or something like that, or some other part of your body like your heart, then sometimes they'll even, you know, go for like an open heart surgery, complete like heart, lung, even transplant, like transplants and all sorts. If you think about how much we're willing to have our body cut up just for the sake of living, it's quite extreme. And because medicine has a lot of suppressive techniques now, such as taking drugs that can suppress the pain quite high levels of pain can be suppressed quite a lot, then of course we have a stronger tendency then to engage those kinds of operations, even though under normal circumstances, if there was no drugs to take, you imagine the extreme pain you'd be in, like after, let's say, you know, like in the first century, somebody having an open heart surgery was unheard of, because you'd have to knock them out and then operate, and then they'd wake up in such shock, and there's no drugs really, aside from things like opium and other things like that could suppress it. So naturally, you know, the average person under those extreme circumstances would die. Nowadays, you can have some very extreme circumstances and live. I knew one fellow who was in a car accident. He lost 7/8 of his blood, so he was left with 1/8 of his blood. Afterwards, he was in a head-on accident. He ended up being in hospital for 11 months in his recovery. Part of his recovery, they had to freeze him, like, so they put him in these sort of bars to slow down his circulation system to an extent where they could start to pump him full of he didn't have a blood transfusion, and they pumped him full of volume expanders, like, so saline and other things like that, to keep him alive, and he fully recovered. Which is remarkable, right?
They would have been so annoyed doing all
that's right. They would have been annoyed, but he fully recovered, and he walked again and everything. He was broken back and everything, but he walked again, and you think about if that happened like the time we lived in the first century, like the chances of recovery were like next to nil, really. Yeah. So yes, all of our problems start with very small problems generally, and they all start emotionally, actually, all of our problems. And then we only become aware of it in our body once the emotion has been suppressed long enough for the disease to begin. Now, the disease can be the desire to create an accident, but it can also be an actual disease, like an actual illness or disease. And then when that is not looked after, obviously things get worse even more. So then, to the extent where we're willing to have body parts, chopped off and taken away, quite extreme, really, isn't it? As to how far society now will go for the sake of preserving life, which is interesting because after you pass, you're still alive. So it's actually because of a lack of faith in you still being alive. There's a lack of faith in an afterlife. So a lot of these extreme things we do are fundamentally caused by a lack of faith in an afterlife. Yeah. So.
As a young person, I had a lot of pain in my legs.
Yeah.
And then I had a long time without any pain.
Yeah.
And now I have the pain in
Yeah.
one side. The question I have is that just because I was numbing myself to the pain?
Yeah. What a lot of people do in their childhood is that children, by the time, usually up until the age of 7 at least, and often in times into your teenage years, there'll be a whole heap of things happening around you, and your body does exhibit the symptoms of those things happening around you, and you're unable to deal with them, and also children are generally unable to suppress very well either. They haven't learnt to use their mind to suppress any symptoms, and so they are generally sensitive to the fact that something is wrong. So as a child, and this probably was the case with all of you as a child, you probably experienced events and illnesses and other things that you were very sensitive to, and you felt them straight away. And this is why also as a child you get things like chickenpox and other diseases like this, because you are very sensitive to there being any imbalance in your environment where love is not engaged, right? So you're very sensitive to an unloving environment. Then as time goes on, and usually this happens by the time you're 10, usually between, after 7 years of age, and when I say after 7, it's really a gradual process. It starts when you're born, and the imposition of emotions, you gradually catch on, right? Intellectually you catch on. I've got to suppress certain things in order so that I don't feel the emotional pain of those things. Now what happens then is you go through a period of time usually, and this is where people are normally between their teenage years and about 30, where you suppress them enough where you don't feel much of them, but your body is still healthy enough to cope with the suppression. So your body is still handling the suppression in the sense that it's not exhibiting symptoms.
And often you develop you've got more agency in those years. You have more you develop your own free will choices to meet addictions that help you to suppress in those years. So for yourself, the reason that pain went away is you developed some addictions that assisted you to do that.
Yeah. And the purpose of the addictions is to suppress your emotional pain. And of course, in the process of suppressing emotional pain, you have a period of time where your body is relatively healthy in comparison to aged, but you basically, you could say it's pregnant with a lot of seeds of discontent for later years in your life, you know, with regard to what's going to now happen in your body. And so usually by the time a person is 30, and sometimes it's 40, they start to get the symptoms again. And then it's like, well, what do I do now? Well, a lot of times it's attributed, isn't it, to old age? You know, I'm just getting old now, and you know that thing's coming back or whatever. We don't think to deal with it emotionally. We don't think it's because of our lack of sensitivity emotionally or anything like that. And so we just choose to continue to not deal with it. And of course, in the dealing and not dealing with it now, the body is now, see, from the time you're about 21 years of age, unless you deal with your emotional problems, from 21 years of age, you're dying. Your cell structure is not going to recover as much anymore, because the imposition of the emotions is going to damage the replication of your cells. And that applies to some cells have a recovery system that's faster than others. So some cells might take up to 7 years, so it's things like your bones might take up to 7 years to recover the problem. And then other cells, such as your eyes, can respond within just a few months to a problem. So, and your brain is another thing that can often respond in a few months to a problem. There are some parts of your body that are, you could say, are more based on fluid. There's more things passing through them. There's more. They're more dependent upon a proper emotional balance than other parts of your body are, and so they will start exhibiting problems generally first, and then things slowly decay. But from 21 years of age, you're dying. Now, if you dealt with your emotional issues, there's no reason why the cell replication process wouldn't continue to occur, and you'd probably stay looking like you're 21 for the rest of your life until, you know, but for obviously you may eventually decide, I do want to move on to the spirit world, because by this stage, if you've lived a long time, you're probably aware there's a spirit world, and so you probably want to move on to it. And so you would allow your body to slowly decay and pass or whatever. But for the majority of people, we've got large levels of fear about dealing with our feelings, large levels of addiction to deny our feelings, and then on top of that, because of those things, from the time we're 21 years old, we're dying. It's just how fast you die now. Now, historically, so during ages like sort of 50,000 years ago or so, by the time people were 35, they would be dead because of all the injuries in the soul and so forth, the inability there's no medicine. So oftentimes, you know, there's times in history where people lasted, you know, on the average till they were 30, 35, and then they passed from old age. Yeah. Nowadays, of course, we can extend life a lot by doing a lot of things. Comforts we have that mean there's less wear and tear on the body. We also often enter quite strong addictive relationships. There's more people on earth who can meet our addictions than there has been in the past. And of course, there's the growing need for technology to meet your addictions as well. And all of these things can add to your lifespan, but only in addiction, and certainly doesn't add to your value of life or your, you know, it being a good life, or a life without pain. We learn to tolerate large levels of pain, and the more desensitized we become, the more we're prepared to tolerate large levels of pain. Yeah.